The LSAT has always been a tough exam. How to prepare for it, how to be ready for LSAC's transition to the digital format, which is happening this summer. And should you take the LSAT anyway, now that more law schools are accepting the GRE? These are all questions that we are going to address with our guest, an LSAT expert and professional coach. Welcome to the 312th episode of Admissions Straight Talk, the podcast dedicated to graduate admissions and helping you approach the application process thoughtfully and successfully. I'm Linda Abraham, the founder of Accepted and the host of this podcast. My mission and passion is to help you show that you both fit in at your target schools and are a standout in the applicant pool. The result, you get a message one day that causes you to jump up and down shouting, "Yes, I'm in!" And not only in, but in the best program for you. The featured resource for today's show is the Law School Admissions Guide, 8 Tips for Success. It's a free download, and you can grab your copy at accepted.com/312download. Again, accepted.com/312download. Our guest today is Steve Schwartz of the LSAT blog and LSAT Unplugged podcast and YouTube channel, which we're going to also link to from the show notes at accepted.com/312. Steve graduated from Columbia University in 2008. In high school and college, he tutored various subjects and also helped prep test takers for standardized tests, including the LSAT. However, he really began to focus on the LSAT when he was applying to law school. He founded the LSAT blog in 2008 and never looked back. Today, 11 years later, he has helped thousands master the LSAT, get into law school, and sometimes secure scholarships worth tens of thousands of dollars. Steve, welcome to Admissions Straight Talk.
Thanks so much for having me, Linda. Pleasure to be with you.
My pleasure. Now, how did you get involved more specifically with LSAT test prep? What's the backstory here?
Yeah, sure. So I got into it back when I was considering law school myself. I was in for a very rude awakening when I took my first diagnostic test and scored a 152, which is right around the average score. And very slowly and painstakingly over the course of an entire year, I brought my scores up to achieve a 175 on test day. And so once I did that, friends started asking for help. I started helping other students at Columbia, and then it kind of just grew and grew from there. It really was not something I expected to do, especially since I started off not doing so well on it. But I found I really loved teaching, and I really enjoyed the LSAT once I came to master it. And so shortly thereafter, I started LSAT blog, and then kind of things just took off from there.
Great. Now, before we turn to your coaching, I'd like to discuss the changes taking place in the LSAT world and the law school world, and there's a lot of changes taking place. First, what's happening this summer specifically with the LSAT?
Yeah, sure. So a number of different things are happening this summer. The biggest one is, of course, that the LSAT is finally transitioning to a digital format. It has always been paper and pencil, and it's the last remaining major grad level exam to go towards digital. But starting in July, they're going to be administering it on a tablet. Specifically, in July, half of students will receive the paper and pencil format, the old format. The other half will receive the digital format. LSAT will choose for the student and won't be telling them in advance. This is kind of their way of doing a controlled study about the results on each side. But then the plan is this fall to transition to 100% digital on the tablet.
And are there any changes in terms of, so the LSAT is going to be the same whether you're on digital or on your paper, right? And that is the idea that the content will remain the same on the LSAT. There's no real change to the content per se, right?
The content itself for the digital LSAT will remain the same. So students who are familiar, you'll have logic games, logical reasoning, reading comprehension. All of that will be identical in terms of content. The only thing that's changing is the style in which it's delivered.
Okay. And I mean, are there changes that you're making in terms of your prep for your students?
There are a lot of changes. I think one of the biggest changes I can think of is that students who are used to writing on the page, drawing diagrams, writing freehand, they will no longer be able to do that. Instead, you'll have scrap paper on the side where you can make any diagrams and notes, but on the tablet itself, you're fairly restricted in terms of what you're able to do. You can't draw on the screen with the stylus the way that you might be able to expect. The other big thing I think students should be aware of is that they're only going to be able to see one question at a time. They won't be able to view an entire set at once, And when you think of logic games as a group of questions, reading comprehension as a group of questions, this is a major change. You kind of have to click back and forth to move to other questions within that set. And so I'm advising students who are not yet familiar with this to practice with PDFs if they can, so they get used to reading the questions on the screen and then having the scrap paper to the side rather than doing questions only on paper out of the books.
Makes sense. That makes sense. Now, one of the other big changes in the law school world over the last couple of years has been more and more schools accepting the GRE. When do you advise applicants to take the GRE instead of the LSAT, or the LSAT instead of the GRE? What's kind of your position on that?
That's a great question. The vast majority of law schools, the LSAT is the focus. I talked to UCLA law admissions dean recently, and he said that they only took about 5% of applicants with GRE scores. And I suspect that these are usually special cases where the applicant is extraordinary in some particular way that makes the school want to overlook the fact that they have not taken the LSAT, maybe folks from STEM backgrounds or folks with impressive resumes. But for the vast majority of cases, they do want to see an LSAT score. They do want to see that you're serious about law school, that you've made that investment in yourself. And I think that I wouldn't advise the average applicant to go for the GRE instead.
Okay. Now, I have a lot of experience in the B school world, and I'd say, I don't remember exactly when the GRE first started to be accepted, but it was probably 10, 12, maybe 15 years ago. I don't think it was quite 15 years ago. And initially, that was how it started. It started with, if you're really serious about business school, you need to take the GMAT, you need to show the commitment, unless you're applying for a dual degree program or something like that. And then it was, we have a slight preference for the GMAT, but the GRE is really okay. And now the siren song in the business school world is, we're agnostic. Take whichever test you're going to do better on. Do you see that happening in the law school world, or do you not have an opinion on that?
I don't think it's quite as likely for a couple of reasons. The biggest one, I think, is that pre-law students don't like math. That's why they went into law, right? So even though the math on the GRE isn't especially difficult, of course, it is math. Pre-laws tend not to like that. And so even
it's more difficult than the math of the LSAT.
Yeah, the LSAT doesn't have math, right? It has puzzles, but most of it's reading related, which folks tend to find more palatable. The other thing is the rankings. We don't yet know how the US News rankings are going to consider GRE scores. It's a big question mark. Right now, if you're an applicant and your LSAT scores are above the median for a particular school, then they would love to have you because you'll boost them in the rankings. We have no idea how the GRE will factor into this. And one thing I would caution students about is, let's say they take the LSAT on an official administration and it doesn't go well. Well, they have that score on record. Even if they now take the GRE, the US News rankings will consider that low LSAT score. So I'd say only take the LSAT when you know you're going to be ready. And once you have a score on file, you have to at least get a better LSAT score, even if you take the GRE as well. And then the last thing I'll say is that the LSAT scores have a very strong demonstrated correlation with first-year law school grades, which then relate to bar passage rates, which law schools care very much about. And the GRE, they've done some correlative studies, but I'm extremely skeptical of those. I think they were looking at students who were likely to do well on standardized tests regardless, not necessarily those who are going to do well on 1L grades in particular to start with.
All right. Let's turn to LSAT Unplugged. There are lots of test prep companies out there. What does your coaching bring to the marketplace that it otherwise lacks?
Well, the biggest thing, of course, is that it's me in particular. I'm a one-man show. I don't have other instructors who are doing this on the side or anything. This is me personally teaching every class, working with every student one-on-one. I guess another big thing is that I release almost everything I do for free. Probably 98% of the material I create is out there on my website, on the YouTube channel, on the podcast. I release recordings of free online classes, recordings of free in-person classes. I've also started releasing one-on-one coaching sessions on YouTube and the podcast. So you can see exactly what it's like to work with me before making a decision. You can consume dozens or hundreds of hours of material and hear me talk forever if you want before deciding whether it's right for you. And I don't know of anyone else out there who's releasing this much material as a free sample of sorts.
All right. Can you give our listeners, since you're so generous, can you give just a few of your best tips right now for, let's focus now on just planning for LSAT prep.
Yeah, well, I mean,
yeah.
How much time
do you recommend somebody allow?
Yeah, in terms of some general advice, I could say that I think most people don't spend enough time devoted to the LSAT prep in particular. Most folks want to spend maybe 2 to 3 months because that's how long it took them to prep for the SAT. But the LSAT is a much more difficult exam and it requires much more of you. And the LSAT score is weighed far more heavily in the law school admission process than the SAT is, for example, in the undergrad admission process. So I think 5 to 6 months is a good amount of time for the average person to reach their fullest potential. So put in the time. The next thing I'd say is don't just do exam after exam and measure your results. The real growth comes from the detailed review process. And you also don't want to start taking practice tests too early. I'd say there are 3 phases of prep that you want to have. First phase is accuracy, doing the problems untimed by type. Second phase is pacing, doing individual timed sections. And finally, the third phase is endurance, doing full-length 5-section timed exams to simulate test day.
And how long is the LSAT again?
The LSAT is a little over 3 hours when you consider 5 sections of 35 minutes each, plus a 10-15 minute break in the middle.
Right. Okay. And how about the day of, let's say the day before the exam and the day of the exam?
So day before, I wouldn't do anything at all. Rest, relax, take it easy. At this point, you either know it or you don't. You're not going to cram for this. This is not a memorization test. So, go for a walk in the park, take a hot bath. Excuse me?
Go to the beach.
Yeah, go to the beach. Yeah, if you're in LA, definitely, right? And then I think the day of the exam, you want to wake up early. The prior week, you want to have at least gone to your test center once. You have a general sense of where it is, how to get there and such. So morning of, you wake up early, you're all packed and ready to go at least the day before. You get there early, you bring some warm-up practice problems to do with you, like do in the car or a coffee shop nearby, and then you avoid other people so they don't stress you out. You just walk in and kill it. And you've done at least, ideally, 10 timed practice tests before this, so this is just another practice test type experience for yourself.
Yeah, practice makes perfect. So it makes you feel more comfortable. What do you see in your crystal ball for LSAT coaching? And you see it, I assume most of your coaching is done over the internet or via webcam like we're using, right? What do you see coming down the pike?
Well, I'm starting to play around a lot more with live online classes and live in-person classes here in New York. And so I'm kind of just experimenting with the medium that is the internet. And now that I'm comfortable being on camera and talking and stuff, I feel like it's a good thing to try out and see, do people want recorded courses, live online, in person, whatever it is. I want to provide that for the students. So I'm kind of experimenting with different models for that. And so folks can always go on the YouTube channel and the podcast to see the recordings of what I've been putting out.
All right, so you're moving more in that direction, it sounds like. Am I correct? Or
Yeah, 100%. I feel like people don't want to read as much anymore. They want YouTube, they want podcasts, and so I'm trying to give them what they want and what's going to allow them also to study on the go. You can watch a video on your phone, you can listen to a podcast on your phone while you're cooking, whatever. So you can kind of get all that, like folks listening to your podcast now, they can kind of make use of that passive time to learn something. And so I want to give that to people.
the gym, whatever, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Any plans on your part to expand into the GRE or other test preps, or are you just busy enough with LSAT?
I'm busy enough with the LSAT, honestly. I love it, and I don't necessarily see it going the same way that it did in the business school world. I think the LSAT is a more complex exam and a more interesting exam, and I love it. And I think a lot of the students who want to go to law school will find the same. And so this is my focus for now. I don't have any plans to go anywhere else.
Okay. What would you have liked me to ask that I didn't ask?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that one good question that I could talk about a bit more is the review process for students who are studying the LSAT.
And I did think another question that I do want to ask, but go ahead.
Oh, sure. So I think for the review process, for the review process specifically, I think that like I said, you want to take exam sections, take full exams, but then before simply checking the answer key and moving on, you want to really engage with that problem in more depth if it gave you trouble. Maybe you work through it timed first. then untimed afterwards and see if your results differed between the two situations to see if it was the timing of the question that gave you trouble or if it was the content of the question that gave you trouble. And then if you ever had a problem with the answer choice, what was tempting about the wrong answer choice that made you pick it, and what ultimately makes it wrong? And what's discouraging about the right answer choice that pushed you away from it, and what ultimately makes it correct? You want to do that again and again and again so you can see these traps of encouragement towards the wrong answer and traps of discouragement away from the right answer, because the LSAT is a really tricky exam. They are laying traps for you. The choices are not random, and so getting a sense of those patterns is really useful.
Right. And obviously the focus on what went wrong is much more useful than the focus on what went right. I mean, there are times to learn from both, but probably in this situation, the best is to really, really make sure you understand what went wrong and how to fix it and how to avoid making it the same mistake again. The other question I wanted to ask you, which came to my mind, is, there's been a drop in LSAT passage rates over the last, basically since 2008. And
maybe you might be in bar passage rates with that.
I'm sorry, bar passage rate. I'm sorry, bar passage rates. And there has also been tremendous shrinking in the law school market, which apparently hasn't affected your business at all. But do you feel that there is a correlation, let's say, to any kind of use of the GRE or the decline in competition for law school spots and average LSAT scores and the drop in the bar passage rate?
That's a great question. I think it's not really due to the GRE, because such a small percentage of applicants have been taken using GRE scores solely. I think instead it has much more to do with the decline in the number of people applying to law school. But there's been a massive expansion in the number of law schools over the past few decades, as I'm sure you know. But if the number of applicants declines, those schools still need to fill their seats. And so they kind of have to dig deeper into the barrel and kind of accept folks who aren't necessarily as capable of passing the bar in the end. And so I think these law schools are in a tough situation because on the one hand, their own interest is to further their own existence, but on the students themselves, maybe some of these students shouldn't have been going to law school in the first place. And that's why the LSAT is such a good indicator of how someone's likely to do in 1L, for example. And so if they can't do well in the LSAT, then maybe, this might sound a little bit harsh, but if you can't get an above average score on the LSAT, if you can't break 150, then maybe law school is not right for you, because we do want to know you're going to be able to do well your first year, that you won't drop out, and that you will, of course, be able to pass the bar in the end and get some ROI on what you spent on tuition.
Right. We actually received an email from somebody, an inquiry from somebody. It was basically, I got in the 130s on the LSAT, and do you think I should retake it? And I of course replied that yes, I do think you should retake it to have a chance at any kind of competitive law school, because and in the back of my mind, I was also thinking that there is a strong correlation between LSAT scores and bar passage. If you can't get it above the 130s, your chances of passing the bar are fairly limited, fairly low. So you have that tension between giving somebody a chance and just encouraging them to incur a ton of debt with no ROI. So
it's so true. And you always, I'm curious what you think, because people always ask me, I got a low LSAT score, should I write an addendum? And I always say, well, just retake. The proof's in the pudding, right? What do you tell folks in that situation?
In the case of a low test score, including the LSAT, I almost always say that an addendum, what are you going to say? There was a jackhammer outside the building. Yes, that will affect your LSAT score. It almost always is best to retake. Now, I can remember, this was probably 20, 25 years ago, I had a client, this was shortly after I started the business, and she was really bright and accomplished. And unfortunately, the day before she went in for the LSAT, I think her mother was diagnosed with breast cancer, advanced stage breast cancer. Wow. And she went in and took the LSAT, and I think got the worst score she'd ever gotten. And the deadlines were approaching, and it was much more rigid. There were fewer test administrations then. We're talking the 1990s, so it was even before before you tried, right? And so in that case, and she had good grades and really impressive applicant. And in that case, I said, you just have to let them know what was going on in your life when you took the test. But these days, when there are so many more administrations, and she also had very good grades, if you come in with a low LSAT and a low GPA and you try and write addenda for both, it doesn't hold water. And if you write an addenda for the LSAT, when there are today many more test administrations than there used to be, again, it's like, why don't you just go and retake it and really show us what you can do?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's another thing we should talk about is that it's gone from that change only happened like this year, really. It went from being 4 times a year to being now 9, 10 times a year, which is nearly every month. There's always another chance to retake just around the corner. In fact, I'm telling folks who are registered for June to also take it in July, because there's only a 5-week or so gap. So all you have to do is stay fresh on the LSAT for another 5 weeks, and you could score 3 to 4 points higher. And if not, no big deal. They only take the highest score.
Wow. And do you think, I believe next year there's more administrations, aren't there? Are they giving...
Yeah, they're upping it to something like 10 a year. I don't think it's quite set what it's going to be going forward beyond that, but it's nearly every month.
That's much different. Much different.
Big time.
And how do you feel about, I mean, in general, my advice always is take the test when you think you're ready, and go for your highest score. Don't take it like as a practice. Do you agree with that, or take practice
100%.
tests offline?
Yeah, there's no need to take an official administration and pay them $200 approximately, and then have a low score on your record. I don't see any upside to that really, other than the proctoring. But a lot of the different LSAT prep companies out there offer free proctored exams for marketing purposes, and you can tune out the sales pitch if you want and just sit there and get the proctored experience. Or you can have a friend proctored or proctored on your own if you're disciplined, and that'll give you a good sense of where you are. But bottom line is, it's going to tell you what you already know, which is that you don't know the LSAT yet, and that's okay. You could get a low starting score like I did, and just know that this is like a foreign language. It is possible to improve significantly, and you'll have to just put in the time. But yeah, don't have a bad score on your record for no reason.
Agreed completely. Steve, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate your taking the time to speak with me. Where can listeners learn more about your LSAT prep work?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Linda, for having me. It was a pleasure. So folks can find me on the LSAT blog. They can just Google Steve Schwartz LSAT blog. They'll find it. I'm also on YouTube and podcasts as well. So the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel, youtube.com/LSAT blog. Then the LSAT Unplugged podcast is available on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, and pretty much everywhere else.
Right. And we're also going to link to it from the show notes at accepted.com/312. The blog, the YouTube channel, all that, as well as we're going to link to other related resources and interviews. Listener, I want to thank you too for joining Steve Schwartz and me for our 312th episode. A quick reminder, grab your free copy of the Law School Admissions Guide, 8 Tips for Success, Acceptance Informative, free guide for law school applicants. You can grab that also at accepted.com, at accepted.com/312 download. So the links are at accepted.com/312. The download is accepted.com/312 download. And a final request, if you find the show worthwhile, please share the good word by leaving a review on iTunes. Your doing so helps us spread the news about Admission Straight Talk. You can find a link in the show notes. Again, that's accepted.com/312. That'll take you both to our iTunes page. There are also links for Stitcher and I think Google Podcasts. And if you want to leave a review elsewhere, that's fine too. Thanks again for coming. This is Admission Straight Talk produced by Accepted, and I'm your host, Linda Abraham. I'll talk to you again next week.